we are very lucky today. We are joined with a certain gentleman, Jeff Wellstead, founder, chief exec, owner of Big Bear Partners, to talk around high performing teams, design thinking, leadership, and all of that great stuff. So, Jeff, thank you ever so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Ollie. Thanks for having me.
Jeff, so close, in Marlow, so near, and yet so far. I can almost touch you from, here in Shiplake, but just out of reach due to the social distancing stuff.
Indeed.
Indeed. But look, Jeff, I thought a great way of starting is just to give everyone a very quick into you, your background, and I mean, reading through the stuff I've read through, a pretty impressive catalogue of things that you've done. But just quickly give everyone a sort of high level on who Jeff Wellstead is and your areas of sort of expertise.
Sure. No, thanks for that. Look, my career spans, it's nigh on about 31 years nowadays. It's kind of crept up on me, and I kind of didn't realize how quickly it was all going to come. The first half of my career was really kind of spent in headquarters companies in and around New York City, where I kind of worked with big multinationals in consulting, investment banking, a little bit of pharmaceutical and technology, and came over here to the UK back in 2004, where I jumped immediately into a very different genre that I have now fallen in love with and really very much enjoy, which is very much around hypergrowth, deep tech companies, and most recently biotech and pharma over here in the UK. My focus is typically about reinventing the people strategy to now start to focus on ways in which you can really find and attract incredibly rare resources to your challenge, and importantly, how then you create incredible experiences that kind of very intelligently, seamlessly, and frictionlessly attract, recruit, onboard, integrate, help develop and perform at an optimum level. And so my focus has gone kind of beyond traditional human resource management, and I'm hoping to kind of disrupt that field and hopefully bring some insightful thinking to how it is we can really explode the exponential outputs of organizations.
And I mean, one of the things you mentioned there sort of feels quite familiar for me from a sporting background, but around that talent ID process. So can you just sort of elaborate a little bit more on where your thinking is around that, and if you like, within some of this deep tech environment that you're now sort of working in, how you're identifying talent and using and leveraging technology maybe to support that?
Yeah, well, it's a big old question, and obviously you're going to have to kind of keep me from rambling on too long about it.
I'll jump in. If it gets long, Jeff, I'll just jump in and be like, stop. Don't worry.
Yeah, enough already. So the kinds of technology companies I typically am working with are typically ones who are bringing technologies to a commercial market that often have not been properly tested or significantly tested previously. And so it's oftentimes the case where I'm working either with machine learning or data analytics or what are some of the other areas? Well, the kinds of companies I work for were folks like Message Labs and Spinbox, which was all about natural language processing and converting voice to text in an automated way. I worked with Skype for a period of time back in the early days before they went and got bought up by Microsoft. And companies like that are sort of on the bleeding edge of what it is they're trying to disrupt. And my focus has always ever been, how do we create a brand that says, hey folks, we're doing something phenomenally different here, and we want to attract people typically away from perfectly good jobs and lifestyles to join a mission, an adventure with somebody they've never heard of before, but where they can have a much bigger role and a much more powerful impact in terms of what they can bring to the fore. And that all kind of informs my employer branding process, which I then kind of apply technology to automate as much of the footwork that kind of typically bogs people down, both on the candidate side of the equation as well as the employer side of the equation, and to make sure that we are bringing technology that works again seamlessly. And really empowers the organization to focus on the things that are more strategic. And so I do a lot of work with human resource teams, but more importantly with management teams to kind of understand, what is your mission? What's your big why? Why is that going to have a huge impact? And how do I get people excited about this whole adventure from the beginning? And then importantly, how can I then speak to you as an individual to say, if you come and join this adventure, we will ensure that you are going to be working side by side with some of the world's brightest people in the space, that you're always ever going to be learning and developing. And we will make every opportunity available to you to continue to have an increasing amount of impact in terms of where it is we hope to go.
Okay.
And so that's kind of my approach typically.
And Jeff, just thinking about that in terms of the, you've seen a broad spectrum of companies over the time scale, and a lot of interesting, amazing businesses. You mentioned even Sky. What are there any sort of consistent themes that you've seen either within the leadership group there, or if you like the purpose behind the organizations, that anything that's sort of consistent that you've seen, like this really needs to be there, or actually some of the most successful companies have had these few things at the heart of them that have really become something you've observed over time?
Yeah, so I've been plugged into working with the folks like Salim Ismail, who wrote a book called Exponential Organizations, which kind of then picked apart really all the unicorn tech companies and said, what are sort of the common attributes, the common themes that these people basically take advantage of to have this incredible impact on their particular sectors. So, looking at companies like Uber and Airbnb and, Tesla and these kinds of companies.
Yeah.
So the consistencies typically are around an incredible moonshot, kind of vision in terms of what it is they hope to disrupt. And typically it is around disruption. It's about taking a particular way of, that we've always ever done something and kind of take into account, the enormity of cloud computing power, the ability to work, with technical capabilities that massively excel both our visibility to the outside world in billions, not just millions, but also in technologies that are really kind of stretching the envelope and kind of reinventing from scratch the way we ever did things, like car manufacturing, like space travel, like the way we look at threats, cyber threats, and manage those, the way that we automate through artificial intelligence, whole strings of what typically used to be inefficient human interactions, and kind of just streamline those things and make them much more efficient. So it's typically that kind of a thing. And the leadership typically are highly technical people. That really hasn't changed. They are not particularly skilled so much with human interaction, which is oftentimes why I typically get involved, in that they're typically really kind of focused on how is it we're going to kind of explode this technology, get it to market, hit revenue, please investors, and make things come real. And then people, of course, you can't do this stuff without incredible knowledge workers to come and help you make that happen. But oftentimes, these organizations can take on a very academic kind of approach to things. And if you're not careful, if you're not really driving a commercial imperative around that, using tools like objectives and key results, as an example, you can very quickly lose your way and kind of spend a lot of time exploring the technology and the moonshot elements behind this and kind of get lost and distracted in that search, as opposed to actually then delivering something consistently to a market that is oftentimes brand new. So so those are the challenges. Yeah.
And Jeff, so there's a lot to sort of unpick there, and I'm sort of fascinated by a lot of it. If I can focus on the latter point, and then maybe ask you about the former one around the sort of the moonshot thinking, but the latter part that you mentioned there, which is sort of having, it's almost like goal setting, like really efficient, good, clear goal setting for individuals when they're coming in and building around that. Like, what's your thoughts around that, around sort of effective goal setting, to make sure that it's aligned, alongside, I guess, moonshot thinking, which is basically creating a new paradigm for how you set goals, and I guess the realms of possibility and delivery. Like, what have you seen in terms of the best performers against, when trying to combine those two dynamics?
Yeah, there's a great book out there that I would encourage anybody to read, that is called Measure What Matters by John Doerr. John Doerr used to be sort of, yeah, it really is fascinating. And it's a great story too. This whole concept got invented by Andy Grove all the way back in the very early 1970s when Intel, which was a very small company, most of which were kind of pirated out of Fairchild Semiconductor out in Silicon Valley when Silicon Valley was just becoming Silicon Valley. And he had realized that they were basically working off some very old, computer chip technology in terms of the architecture of those computer chips, and suddenly realized when he got a hold of some micro devices that came out of Japan that he'd been doing it and thinking about it all wrong. That basically Japan had reinvented, the computer chip, the compute power, and put 10x, the level of computational power into chips that we were basically, kind of scrounging out off of silicon plates. And he was like, oh dear God, we're going to be out of business literally in a matter of months. And we need a process very quickly to kind of turn everybody's mind into a much more kind of fluid, much more highly adaptive approach. And so he introduced this notion of objectives and key results, whereby he said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to set no more than 3, critical objectives for the organization on an annual basis. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have somewhere between 3 and 5, key results that are going to be highly measurable. And we're going to say, if we achieve those key results, then that objective is arguably met. And each one of these objectives are going to be kind of moonshot objectives. They're going to be really pushing the envelope. So I will be happy with hitting only 70% of that target, because if we do that, we're in with a shot in terms of our survivability. So that's basically what the essence of the OKR method was. And John Doerr, who then went on to, I think, be the chairman over at Kleiner Perkins and worked with a lot of crazy Silicon Valley startups like Google, where, was that Sergey Brin and Larry Page were in their garage and basically working off of a PC and trying to kind of make sense as to what they were going to do. He sat down with those guys and said, well, you guys have to set a powerful vision for yourselves. And it's got to be a lot bigger than search, because there's a lot of different companies in the search place. And to be the best search engine is probably not a big enough moonshot. And that's when they kind of got into the notion of doing personalized advertising based on scanning everybody's behavior around the internet and all sorts of things. And suddenly they got it. But they also realized this is going to be a hell of a lot more complicated than we ever thought. So we're going to need to have some kind of a very visible, very transparent hierarchy that communicates to anyone, anywhere, who can tap into our servers, what it is we're meant to be getting done. And then importantly, each one of those individuals and teams and departments need to develop their own OKRs that directly attach to parent objectives that sit at the company level. And we're going to go through those things relentlessly. We're going to turn them into sprints. We're going to have it's the whole agile process that was born really at that point. We are going to re-examine this stuff at great frequency, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to course correct fast enough, basically, to kind of stay on par and to deal with changes that we need to make at speed. So OKRs have become like the next new thing. And that's actually a piece I'm working with.
Just to clarify for listeners, they're all listening to this that maybe haven't heard OKR before. What is an OKR? What's the definition around that? And equally, then, just to build that out a bit more, that continuous feedback loop and ability to learn and grow. Mm-hmm. Where does that fall down? If as well, looking at OKRs, where have you seen that done really well? Where have you seen that done really badly in organizations? And then obviously let people know what an OKR is.
Yeah, so an OKR basically is, again, objective and key results. So the objective is the qualitative thing that you're trying to get done. And typically that could be a fairly big thing, like, we are going to redesign the computer chip and create, a micro device with 10x the power, as an example. And so if you notice, there are no numbers in that. There's nothing specific that says, this is exactly what
moonshot
we have to hit.
Big goals, moonshot thinking type stuff for the O part of the OKR. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So this is the big thinking bit, but it has to be underpinned by somewhere between 3 and 5 key results that are very much about a measure, and that measure could be monetary. That measure could be a X percentage increase in power. It could be a yes or no. Did we or did we not get that done? As an example, but that is the bit that you focus on and literally kind of examine every 2 weeks to see what kind of progress you're making on the delivery of that objective.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's kind of the construct of it. It's simple as, but it's it's a heck of a lot harder to actually deliver to it.
To ask you that question, when you just sort of said it's really hard to do it, what scenarios, what companies, what people have you seen that have done it really, really well? And what did they do? What were the things they stuck to? And equally, which ones have you seen where they didn't quite pull it off or didn't quite work?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky in that it's as intuitive and simplistic as it appears. There's a lot of intensity and complexity that kind of sits behind it. So what it really does is, if you could imagine sitting down and you're kind of developing your company and you're having to kind of go through some massive pivot, as an example, what it gets you guys to do, it gets the company to do, is to really narrow your focus on what things are we going to get done week on week, month on month, quarter on quarter to hit annual targets. And it basically focuses the minds of everybody in the organization and really kind of forces a fairly significant and healthy debate around, do we really need to be worrying about that right now? Is the scope of that objective too big or too small? Are we basically going to achieve overall the pivot that we hope to make one day with that set of objectives and key results sitting behind it? So it's really kind of the debate behind it, and it's the arguments that you have about, is it right sized, right fit, right complexity, and right direction, for the organization. Companies I've seen do that horribly well are typically kind of somewhat dictatorial at the top and really laser focused on what they want to deliver. Like, as an example, SpaceX. Basically Elon Musk wanted to completely disrupt, the traditional military industrial complex and the ridiculous spend that they kind of often put in the building of rockets. He understood they were complex creatures and they were very difficult to create, but he was like, there's got to be a way to be able to reuse rockets. It's insane that we just throw all that stuff away with every flight. And these things cost, tens of millions to put together just for one SpaceX. So why don't we reduce that by, and this might be one of the objectives, I want to completely, restructure the entire space flight, kind of program and create a much more sustainable, kind of resourcing behind that as an example of an objective. And then the key results behind that would be to create a reusable rocket. Did you do that? Yes or no? By reducing the amount of waste and cost associated with the building of a singular rocket by a factor of 10x would be an example. These are like mega OKRs.
That's probably an OKR in itself, right? I mean, the big objective.
No, it is. Well, and that's it.
The key results part.
Yeah, and the child objectives that sit underneath that parent objective would be all about, what is engineering going to do to create a reusable rocket? What are the components behind that? Finance would probably have one around, how is it we're going to track, the expenditure and reduce the overall costs associated with developing reusable rockets, as an example. And then everybody would basically take a piece of that and say, this is what we are going to contribute specifically to that, and we're going to track that every 2 weeks.
Okay, so Jeff, so I've got the idea and the vision around an OKR. But then let's come back to the visionary leader. You mentioned some of the people already, but like Elon Musk or whatever else that are. You said it, very technology driven, very very data or techie in that sort of sense. But not that brilliant or au fait with the sort of people integration or teams necessarily. Mm-hmm. So in order to achieve that moonshot thinking, those big objective goal statements, mission statements, they need to rely on others around them and knowledge sets around them. What are the keys therefore around actual sort of team integration, creating culture, leadership in that environment to make sure that actually you're delivering? It's all well and good having one of those big moonshots bits of thinking, but if you can't actually disseminate the message, communicate the message well, then it'll fail. So what are you sort of seeing from the companies you've been in with and the research you've done around the leaders, the companies that integrate their people the best, recruit the best talent, nurture the best talent, and create the best cultures in order to grow?
Yeah, no, excellent question. So it's kind of a two-part element. It's one thing to have a very powerful technical and disruptive dream and ambition to go tackle, but then the question very quickly becomes one of, look, we filled this place full of brilliant technical people, and they're all going to contribute in their own right something powerful. But the problem is now we have to do this together, and there's no way around it. This is going to require the brightest minds working in a collaborative way, probably cross-functionally, cross-disciplinary, to basically come up with, some really clever, forget the box. There is no out of the box thinking. The box doesn't exist, and it never has done. So now we're going to invent the box. And how do we go about doing that? And that really kind of speaks to really a larger question, which is, how are we going to behave as a group of people? How are we going to ensure that we are going to be able to deliver these outrageous ambitions at light speed and not break in the process and fall down and just fail at every turn? That then requires a level of thinking around, how do we create a high-performing human environment and make sure that the conditions for high performance are actually put into place? Because dysfunctional human environments are rife. I mean, they're everywhere. I've worked for loads of them. I've worked for 19 companies over the course of 31 years. And I've had my fair share of deep dysfunctional organizations that are, that don't trust each other, are highly political, backstabbing, finger pointing, who are afraid potentially to speak truth to power, and possibly are missing one opportunity after another in terms of what might be a massive turning point for an organization, and just letting things kind of rot on the vine. And of course,
and Jeff, if you've seen that across, your career so far across 19 different organizations or whatever else, how do you prevent that? How do you stop environments or cultures evolving into that? Because I think maybe this is too much stereotyping, but I believe that people in general are sort of not inherently nasty. I mean, there's obviously the odd exception to that rule, but these cultures do evolve, and there are these arenas and environments whereby trust is just not apparent. There is a lot of backstabbing, as you said. So my question is loaded in terms of two front. One, why do you think that's occurring? What are the prompts and causes of that? And then equally and conversely, in other organizations where you've seen it not be like that, what are they doing? What are they doing that's so different that is creating a total contradiction or total opposite to some of these other organizations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So it's fascinating. I've read book after book after book about why do companies basically fall into a level of dysfunction that is unrecoverable, versus some other companies basically that go in with a very strong intent and somehow find some cultural magic that they are able to rally these bright minds in a very, very productive way, and actually come out with positive result after positive result. And I look at, and I've always followed companies like, as an example, Netflix is a great example, which arguably didn't get it right the first several times, and tried and experimented with a whole variety of different approaches to how it is they do this. Reed Hastings and Patty McCord, his first HR director, ultimately ended up putting together the Netflix manifesto that kind of explained how it is they created this notion of a freedom within a framework, and allowed these bright minds to go and create and deliver at an exponential rate, at a very high performing rate. And they basically created the positive conditions for them to do that, rewarding obviously the desirable behaviors and outcomes very, very loudly, but also very quickly and swiftly dealing with folks who were mediocre or underperforming, and sent a message very loud and clear that average basically gets you a severance package at Netflix. Now, I then kind of stumbled upon a really interesting book by Patrick Lencioni, who's rather prolific in this space. It has a very interesting writing style. And he wrote a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And I thought, that's a very non-intuitive kind of title. Why do I want to read about how to create the 5 dysfunctions? But in truth, what he was trying to show via his parable, which was sort of around a fictional company called Decision Tech, how a perfectly good, at least on paper, a perfectly good executive team could really muck things up, and broke down the various elements of that into a neat and nifty pyramid. I'm always somewhat cautious of these things because consultants are notorious for oversimplifying things to the point where it's useless. But I think he really kind of nailed it based on my personal experience in business, whereby he said, look, it's a pyramidal layer, trust being the base of that pyramid. And if you don't have trust where people can be vulnerable, people can exchange ideas and not be judged for who they are or how they said something, what they can do is at least kind of work together to share their common notions around how to make an idea better or how to solve a particular problem and kind of work on up. The next layer up above that was the really powerful one, I think, is called constructive conflict. And that's what all the best companies do, the folks that I've just been talking about, all the big unicorn companies, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and so forth, is this notion of we need to have the comfort and trust that we can be extraordinarily honest about whether or not an idea is worth pursuing or this problem is going to be solved in this particular way. And that's tricky because that's where companies typically fall down. Things get personal, people don't do it well, they don't do it right, they end up upsetting each other, and then things go political and factions go to war. The one above that is then kind of gaining a level of commitment, personal commitment around the delivery of the thing that the team has actually agreed upon. And then that leads typically to a sense of personal ownership and accountability to actually own your part of the delivery of the thing you all agreed you were going to go do. And then creating a culture around the fact that results matter. They don't just matter, they are lifeblood to us. And they desperately need to be the best possible results we can get. Now, that all takes a hell of a lot of energy, a lot of insight, and a lot of enlightened thinking from leadership to say, we have to maintain this culture that avoids the 5 dysfunctions of a team to ensure that we have the most high-performing environment we possibly can create. So I look at companies like Netflix, like Spotify, are 2 wonderful examples where they are all about, Zappos is another interesting one, where they were all about the people and kind of, again, creating the right psychological environment for people to interact and to grow with each other and develop and deliver.
Jeff,
yeah.
One of the 5 things that I've heard you speak around there: trust, constructive conflict, commitment, accountability, and results.
Yeah.
So the five building blocks, if you like, of a highly functional team, but equally through the other lens, if you get it wrong, they're of highly dysfunctional teams. How do you make sure you're staying on the right side of the line, if that makes sense? If you said, trust is at the core, which I agree. How do organizations, how do people ensure that they're building trust and that is therefore engendering people to provide constructive conflict, constructive feedback, rather than just arguing the toss and having a go at everyone, that then engenders commitment and everything to the cause, right? Because I imagine you can go down a certain route, and before you realize you've gone too far, and you're like, oh God, this is actually the wrong culture that we've wanted to create here. So how do you make sure from the outset that you're building trust in the right way, that will therefore lead to your other sort of 4 pillars or 4 building blocks to be a positive experience?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is where leadership really kind of steps up to the plate on this thing. And they have to basically be seen to be living these values and this approach, such that that everybody looks at that and says, okay, that's what success looks like. If you want to be the top person or the top people, then you need to behave in this way. You need to operate in this way. And so living by example is critical. Having a culture of intention, and I mean, literally designing a culture that says we're not just going to put passive nice words on a wall, we're actually going to talk about who it is we want to be as an organization and the impact we want to have on people and the planet. We are then going to back that up with core values that we will look to and refer to every time we have to make a decision, especially hard decisions. And we are basically going to live by that codification. And that is going to be our route forward. Oh, by the way, this is how it is we're going to kind of embrace high performing teams. And these are the behaviors, these 5 behaviors around trust and conflict and commitment, accountability, and results that we need everybody to absolutely embrace. We're going to put all sorts of reinforcement behind that. So we're going to reward and recognize very loudly people who really get this and do a good job of it. And we're going to have some very direct and very specific conversations with those folks who frankly choose, passively or actively not to kind of engage with that sort of thing. We'll be respectful. We'll give, we'll deal with it with dignity, but we're going to send a message loud and clear that this is how we need you to behave if we're going to actually achieve these ambitions. So it is a decision to make, and it is not done lightly. You are creating a new religion, and your Bible is all of those things I just talked about. And then the rituals behind that are basically how you bring it to action.
I love that. So you're creating a new version of the Bible and being intentional in how you build your culture within your organization. What can I just sort of ask a devil's advocate question? When you're small, I imagine that's easier to do, right? When you're 10, 20, or maybe even 100 people, maybe that's easier. Where does it go wrong when you get to 1,000, 5,000, 100,000 people?
Yeah, I mean, maintaining, I tell you what, that growth trajectory in terms of a hyper growth company that's going on a scale up journey is possibly as dangerous as the big company that frankly isn't keeping up technologically, with the world. Very different kinds of problems, but can have the same result. And so it's really critical that even if you are a 1,000-person company and you've been around for 17 years, that you explore, kind of inheriting or engaging with these new ways of thinking. And by the way, there are, ample number of consultative workshops and tools and things of that nature that basically help, kind of create a real exercise around this, so you can actually convert your organization and your leadership and so forth into potentially a high performing organization. But again, it really takes a commitment from the top and a recognition of the fact, if you are already established and you're a big 1,000, I say big, I'm used to dealing with companies that are somewhere between 100 and 500 typically. But if you're a bigger company than that, you have to wake up to the fact that you're not doing it right, potentially, that there are possibly way better ways of doing things, and that the science and technology behind human organizational psychology has moved on. Possibly not as quickly as the digital revolution has, but nonetheless, it's here. And externalities are kind of forcing us to rethink how it is we kind of play and work in organizations, especially around COVID and the pandemic and everything else. Now we have something like 30 to 50% of the working population globally wanting to work remotely, whether that be from home or from a beach or from someplace. But yeah, they don't necessarily want to go into work anymore. So that kind of adds to layers of challenge and responsibility to leaders who say, okay, this isn't my dad's company. This isn't my mom's company. This is all different, and we need to kind of rethink it. And the only way you do that is ensure that, again, you're hiring at a really high level the best possible people you can, that you're loving them all the way through the recruitment and onboarding and integration process, and that you're developing them like hell to make sure that they stay with you, and they see you as a destination career. But you also then have to delegate, and you have to democratize the responsibility for delivering, highly ambitious products and solutions. And that means you have to trust your organization to do that. You have to trust the leaders at every level, especially the team member level, to basically kind of drive this pattern of thinking around avoiding the 5 dysfunctions and embracing, high performance as an approach. And then, like I said, that's HR's job as an example, to really ensure that all of the infrastructure is there to support and reinforce that.
And Jeff, one thing I mean, building on that as well. So one thing I sort of read around some of the literature that you write about, speak about, was around, if you're wanting to be one of those high growth unicorns and an exponential organization, there were 2 things that I read that you sort of spoke around, which were the attributes of exponential organizations around abundance. That was the operative word that I'd heard, but abundance of scale and abundance of ideas, and that fusion across the 2. So can you talk a little bit around that? Like, let's say you've built your new Bible, you've managed to create this culture of love and trust across 50 to 5,000 people, whatever is the size of your business. Like, as you're growing exponentially now, what do you need to do in terms of that delivery, or managing that scale, I should say, and facilitating and fostering, cultivating ideas?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I'm just, as we're speaking, I was just going to pull up some imagery around to kind of explain the ideas and scale thing. But the essence is the ideas side. Well, first of all, what you have to do is you have to start with a massive transformative purpose. That's what typically all of these unicorn companies have. They have this world-changing view that they're going to do things so radically differently that they're going to have an effect on billions of people, not millions of people, which is entirely possible and plausible, with the internet today. The ideas side of that equation has to do with the more technological components to it, things like interfaces between your technology and individuals, the users, and so forth. The use of dashboards and gathering data on a regular basis in real time, and to be able to kind of dynamically adjust to what you're seeing. Embracing experimentation and a growth mindset. So this notion of kind of applying, kind of experimental method, if you will, to the things that you're playing with to see whether or not it's going to work, even if it's an A/B test, but making sure that you're testing it first before it goes live. Applying automated software and capability that gives you levels of autonomy, as well as psychological autonomy in terms of leaders letting people in their organization take accountability and responsibility and drive things forward. And then embracing the whole capability of social, media platforms and social, digital content and things of that nature, which allow you to do so much more and reach out to so many people and to grab ideas from all over the place. So that's the ideas side of the equation. And the other side is around scale, and that's around more kind of the human element to a degree, but like staff on demand, the ability now, for instance, like an Uber, to basically operate with a relatively few number of individuals at the center, but create a global taxi service, literally through an app on a phone using your own car. Embracing the community and crowd, basically to reach out to people as they are trying to do with Hyperloop, as an example. That is actually a global consortium of some of the top scientists on the planet who are getting together casually at their own pace and when they want to engage, ultimately to kind of lend their design and engineering ideas to make Hyperloop a reality. Algorithms, of course, super powerful. The notion of having a computer basically cover off millions of different transactions and pull together a multitude of different computational challenges and literally just make sense of it at an instant is really huge, like Airbnb, as an example. The notion that you can put your own property onto a platform and share it with the world and basically make money off of additional rooms in your house and so forth. Leveraged assets, similar kind of thing. Uber leverages your own, people's cars. Airbnb leverages, people's actual properties, but never owns any of it. So it's a real disruptive move for the hotel industry, as an example. And then the last element is around engagement, which is how is it we psychologically kind of reach into your life and really become that much more value added that it kind of changes the way you think, work, act, and engage, with your world. So those are sort of the elements of or the attributes associated with exponential organizations, and they're really game changing. By the way, not every one of these organizations embraces all 11 elements. You can't, you know what I mean. But certainly at least minimally 4 or 5 of them.
And what's the role of people throughout all of that? There's some fascinating insights around cultivating and canvassing for ideas, implementing them. Technology is playing an enormous role, and that's obviously teaching everyone to suck eggs who's listening to this in terms of actually how you get the scale. But some people, I think, particularly pandemic as well, are feeling a bit disenfranchised, a bit disconnected from their workspaces, from their organizations, maybe even those big moonshot mission statements. Like what is the role that society, people have to play in this exponential growth curve of organizations, or just game-changing ideas? Like where does that fit for you?
Well, that's a big question. So when you say how do people fit into that, certainly people who people who are wanting to have a powerful kind of exponential level of impact and change on the world are now finding platforms to participate in all over the place. So from that perspective, we're creating new homes for some incredibly bright people. And if nothing else, we're kind of realizing that potentially we're going to be short a couple of people unless we really start to kind of,
Yeah,
generate.
well, the relevant question is, the pace with this exponential growth is happening. Do you think actually community, societies, people can actually keep up with the speed? Like, are we skilled enough? Is probably the more relevant question. Do we have enough talent and capability out there?
Yeah, well, yeah, you touched on a tricky one, right? And one that, by the way, is admitted to all the time, especially when Salim Ismail and Peter Diamandis get together and they talk about basically the future of the world, 10 years, 15 years hence. It's pretty scary stuff. And one of the things that many of their guests, when they have them on these webinars and so forth, talk about is the fact that we are actually going to be, in the course of the next 15 years, potentially eliminating more traditional jobs in a shorter frame of time than has ever happened on the planet Earth within the human civilization. And that's going to throw up some very powerful challenges to government, to technologies, corporations, and everything else, whereby we potentially are going to put out of work hundreds of millions of people in a very short space of time. With automated driving, truck drivers, assembly line workers, and all sorts. That's going to create challenges around, God, what do we do about this? Do we create a level of universal income? How is it these people are going to be reinjected and become part of a productive society? How are they themselves going to feel productive, like they've got something to do? I mean, on one hand, it's great. You get your life back a bit. The other hand, it's a little bit scary because you might not have any money to buy groceries or kind of maintain your housing lifestyle. So it's going to be super tricky. It is clearly becoming a situation, at least from the technical side of the equation, that technologists and the folks that we are training in schools today and potentially start to train vocationally are going to have to rethink their jobs. They're going to have to be, kind of folks who worry about things like robot maintenance, as an example, as opposed to assembly line worker. So, gosh, this reskilling issue is massive. And organizations all around the world, as we speak, are embracing huge programs in that regard. Great example, AT&T basically realized that 5G, all right, 5G wavelength technology is literally going to make obsolete 2G, 3G, and 4G almost simultaneously when that becomes ubiquitous enough. And of course, that's a challenge too, because it's quite expensive infrastructure. But then they had a problem, right? Because all of their engineers were trained on things like 3 and 4G technologies and all the infrastructure around that. And their CFO did the maths on it and said, it will actually cost us more to terminate and rehire all of the engineers we need with the right skill sets, basically, to go manage this 5G revolution than it will be for us to actually upskill our existing population. So they basically decided, I kid you not, to pour in something like $2 or $3 billion into an upskilling and retraining program for all of their engineers. And that's the process that they're actually undertaking right now. But that's the level, that's the quantum of calculation that the world is having to contend with at the moment.
Yeah, but it comes back to something you mentioned earlier on, which is an investment into your people fundamentally is absolutely critical for business success, personal success, whatever. You need your fans, if you like, to come along with you for the ride. Otherwise, it becomes a bit obsolete. I mean, this has been an amazing conversation. I can't believe that actually sort of 50 minutes has flown by in this conversation. And I'll be honest, I've got so many other questions that I'd like to ask. I think I think, to be honest, Jeff, I think we're going to have to call it at that. Otherwise, we're going to literally run on for hours. I think maybe we get you back on again to actually sort of explore in more depth around, okay, well, what does this actually mean now in terms of how you still maintain and build business culture across an organization? I think that is something I would really like to understand. Even though you've got all this disruption, all this technology, what I'm hearing for you in your AT&T example is people are still at the core, and you need to make sure that you don't run too fast that they can't keep up. with it all,
Right.
whether that's your external stakeholder or your internal stakeholder. So how do you make sure that you are, I guess, balancing the exponential growth, moonshot thinking with actually are we bringing everyone along for the ride? Otherwise, we're going to create a business and a product that's just totally obsolete because nobody knows how to use it and nobody knows how to repair it and deliver it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just one final point on this whole thing, and it's a bit scary. Sure. But just as we are experiencing currently a mass extinction event on the planet with regard to the number of species that are dying off and rainforest degradation and things of that nature, we are equally experiencing a mass extinction in terms of traditional legacy thinking around business and organizational structures and things of that nature, that if we don't wake up, like AT&T as an example initially did, well, it's to be seen as to whether or not they actually can capitalize and optimize on this. But if we don't all wake up to the fact that everything has changed, I mean, everything, and we need to basically reformulate the way we think about business, the way we think about people, the way we think about skilling and kind of developing folks, and the kinds of technologies and areas of focus that we need people to kind of be able to support and grow and do. We're going to be in a very, very shaky, weird place very, very quickly. And by the way, this is very true for the economy as well, I hate to say. But the whole argument between, are we going cryptocurrency, like literally getting rid of central banking? That is actually a debate that is highly active at the moment, and people are discussing, do we get rid of the old style, basically, of debt creation, which then drives wealth creation, and just throw that out the window and basically hand it over to blockchain and get rid of banks, and everybody basically just does transactions on the web. No fees, I mean, there should be fees, but it'll be nothing like the archaic and very inefficient systems we have today. So there's a lot that's going to be changing very, very soon.
Jeff Wellstead, you are a freedom thinker, a disruptor at the very, very heart of it. It's brilliant to have you on the channel. What a fascinating insight. I can't wait for sort of round two, but thank you ever so much for coming on and for chatting. It's been brilliant, to be honest. Absolutely unbelievable. I feel like we've barely even touched the surface.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, there's a lot of drill down we need to be doing. So we'll schedule that in.
That'd be brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much, Jeff. It's been great.
Pleasure.